Good afternoon and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, and I'm the CEO of the Private Bank in Asia and Vice Chair for Investment Banking in Greater China for JP Morgan. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation with two eminent leaders, Honorable David Milliband and Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, to discuss how COVID-19 is impacting women and girls around the world and what we can all do to help. JP Morgan is proud to be a founding partner of the Wealthier Her network in both Asia and the UK. We share their commitment to driving the economic advancement of women and empowering women with support and knowledge to achieve this. And with these shared values in mind, we are excited to be partnering with them for this conversation. Today, women make up 70% of the life-saving health and social services workers globally, which we all have been relying on throughout the current crisis. Yet, women still earn just 75 cents of every dollar men make. And during times of crisis, domestic, sexual, and gender-based violence increase. Today, we are delighted to have with us two extraordinary leaders, David and Phumzile, who will share with us their insights on why and how women are disproportionately impacted by the current COVID-19 outbreak, and what the international community can do to mitigate the impact of the current pandemic on women. David is President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. He oversees the agency's humanitarian relief operations in more than 40 fragile and war-affected countries. Under his leadership, IRC is now running a mission to end gender inequality in the world's most dangerous places by improving access to healthcare, enabling adolescent girls to stay in education, investing in economic and social empowerment for women, and challenging gender norms. The organization was founded in the 1930s by Albert Einstein in response to refugees fleeing the Second World War, the very crisis that drove David's parents to Britain. And as the son of refugees, he brings a personal commitment to the IRC's work. Prior to joining the IRC, David also had a distinguished political career, serving as the youngest UK Foreign Secretary in 3 decades. We are also delighted to welcome Dr. Phumzile, who is United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Director of UN Women. She brings a wealth of experience and expertise to this position. She was actively involved in the struggle to end apartheid in her home country, South Africa, where she also had a distinguished political career, serving as Deputy President of South Africa. She's the founder of the Mlambo Foundation, which supports leadership and education, and a longtime champion of women's rights, empowerment, and gender equality. So thank you, Phumzile, and thank you, David, for joining from your respective time zones. With that, I would now like to hand it over to Sherry Favari, head of our Philanthropy Center for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, who will moderate the conversation with our two distinguished speakers.
Thank you so much, Phumzile, and a very warm welcome to everybody this morning and this afternoon for some as well. And this evening for some as well. So, David and Phumzile, COVID-19 has clearly affected every community in every corner of our planet. And whilst we know that the virus tends to affect men more seriously from a mortality rate perspective, is it fair to say that women are more impacted by the pandemic on other levels, perhaps as their work demands as frontline workers, or in their homes, in their communities, through the spikes in domestic violence, sexual exploitation that we're seeing? Can you both help us understand how women are disproportionately impacted by this pandemic and why this is the case? So, David, if I may start with you.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. First of all, can I say what an honor it is to be on a platform with Dr. Mlambo-Ngcuka. She's an extraordinary leader, and she's now playing a very important role as the Under-Secretary General of the UN. So I feel very much that I'm going to learn something from today's event, and I feel very pleased to be able to represent the views of the International Rescue Committee in this conversation. What I would say is two things. First of all, let's remember the situation before COVID started. We came into the COVID crisis in the midst of the largest humanitarian disaster, at least as measured by the refugee and internal displacement flows since the Second World War. 30 million refugees, 50 million now internally displaced people, according to the latest figures. Women and children make up the majority of those people. And we know that before the crisis of COVID even started, the inequalities faced by women and girls in humanitarian distressed circumstances around the world outstripped those of men. We know that levels of poverty are higher, levels of violence are higher, levels of education are lower, levels of security are lower. And so the pre-existing condition was that while globally there'd been a reduction in overall poverty, and in the 15 years up to 2015, a rise in the number of people going into education, for example, in developing countries, also an improvement in the life chances of women in a good number of countries that have attained middle-class status. We also know that in war-torn countries, the correlation between extreme poverty and conflict was rising. And so that was the situation before COVID. COVID, it seems to me, represents a double emergency for women and girls around the world. The first part of the emergency is the health emergency. And we know from previous humanitarian emergencies, not just that women are the largest part of the formal caring sector, they're also the largest part of the informal caring sector. And so, for example, if you look at the statistics from Ebola in West Africa and in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we're still fighting Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo. If you look at the statistics there, the predominant health and caring responsibilities of women led to them facing extra health burdens. And we expect that to be the case. We can see that to be the case in the places that we're working around the world. 40 countries, about 13,000 employees and 17,000 auxiliary workers that work for the International Rescue Committee. We're beginning to see this, although the disease started in advanced industrialized countries in China and in the US and Europe. We're now seeing it spread in the places where we work. The second part of the emergency, though, is absolutely key, and that is the economic and social collateral damage of the virus and of the lockdown that's associated with it. And in this respect, we know that the people who are least likely to go back to school when schools start are the girls. We know that from previous emergencies. We know that the economic precipice that many women-headed households live on is a real danger when there is the kind of lockdown that's happening at the moment. And we also tragically know from previous emergencies that levels of violence against women and girls rise during emergency situations, rise according to studies that we've done 3 or 4 times. And the anecdotal evidence is that we have that going on at the moment. President Macron, I think, has spoken of a silent pandemic, and the silent pandemic is a pandemic of domestic violence in families that are confined to their own homes. Now, obviously, in the circumstances that we work in northwest Syria, where there are 3.5 million people. We work in the refugee camp in Bangladesh, where 1 million Muslims were driven out of Myanmar. These are unusual circumstances, but we also experience higher levels of domestic violence there. So I think the challenge for us is very clear. We went into the crisis with high levels, in some cases pervasive levels, of gender inequality, and the crisis itself threatens to exacerbate them. And what I look forward to talking about is the role of private philanthropy in helping to tackle this, because the truth, and the Undersecretary General can speak to this very powerfully, the truth is that while an increasing number of governments around the world are using the right words, they're not taking the right deeds to tackle these problems. And I look forward to a conversation about how we can take action to address the diagnosis that I've given.
Thank you. I think that was very articulately, very lot of complicated messages, very articulated there. So, Dr. Phumzile, may we turn to you for your perspective?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Nice to see David again, and thank you so much for being such a powerful advocate for many important causes, including the women's cause. Firstly, let me just highlight that we should remember that every crisis has a gender dimension, and this crisis is no different. And these conversations are important for us to highlight, because we enable those who are trying to help to recognize that, because a gender-blind response misses out the very important needs that women have in times of crisis. In many crises, David has mentioned Ebola, for instance. Zika was the same. We have seen that women are not just affected by the health crisis. They are affected by the circumstances surrounding the response to the crisis as the underlying inequalities resurface. And again, we have seen that in this crisis. The necessary lockdown that many countries tend to, for women meant locked in with an abuser. And those countries who did not call for the services needed by women affected by violence as essential services meant that overnight, where those services existed, those services were actually being denied when they were most needed. It was the countries that managed to open the passage to the women and the passage out for the women who gave women some help and hope. But that was not the uniform case. And part of our work has been to knock at the doors of different countries demanding that these services are made to be essential. Women also were affected economically because the majority of the women, especially in the countries and the places that David and myself work in, most of the women are in the informal sector, and they trade in open spaces. To the extent that people could not be in open spaces, it meant that their livelihood was denied. And the fiscal stimulus, some of them highly sophisticated, were not always designed to reach this target group. And so we have had to, again, engage governments about targeting women. And because women are informal, they are not registered, and for some reason, also, they don't just find it easy to deal with government, even when governments are trying to help them. And thanks to civil society, who have been also providing support to bring these services closer. So again, poverty, hunger, then visited women. Maternal health, which is one area where we've made progress in the last 20 years, became compromised because of the burden that the hospitals were facing, and some of the services that were pushed out were the services. And of course, I will not repeat education. David has mentioned girls' education has been one of the areas where we're seeing some success. And in this case, girls being at home, they just get relegated to chores and not to studying at home. And if they have to get help to study, if they're in a poor home, it's always a choice between them helping the house and them being helped to study. Over.
Thank you. No, that's it's actually really terrifying when we think about all the different challenges that you have both captured and how much progress has been made, globally over the last sort of decade or so, possibly being just wiped out by this crisis exacerbating existing inequalities. So thanks. So now we have a better understanding, hopefully, of some of the key challenges faced by women and girls in the COVID context. I want to just spend some time exploring how the organizations that you both lead are addressing these challenges. So please do, tell us a little bit more about your organizations. And if I may, I'll start with Phumzile. UN Women is quite unique because you engage with gender equality issues at every level, from boots on the ground at a grassroots level to advocacy and policy change on a global scale. Can you help us understand kind of what are the main levers of change that you're activating at UN Women to address the current crisis?
Yeah. Well, firstly, we provided right at the beginning policy briefs, which we handed over to the Secretary General to issue so that we can raise the stakes. And they provided a framework for government to understand the need to have a gender lens to this response. And of course, our offices in different parts of the world engaged with policymakers with very uneven success in making sure that they knew that they needed a differentiated response. We also were involved in the emergency services, anything from food parcels to providing PPEs, which is not quite our strength. But as you know, in an emergency, you do what you have to do. And at the same time, we're trying to lay the foundation for the long-term engagement with the problem. For instance, not just food parcels, we needed to roll back to agriculture immediately so that we could focus on food security through food production, not only through food parcels, which in any case is quite a tall order for us. We also have been working with WHO on providing sex disaggregated data so that we can have some evidence to show what has happened to women also for the long term. We will be needing that evidence. In many countries, women sprang into action providing PPEs, both for their livelihood as well as to service their communities. And we are trying to see how, by doing that, we must actually be helping them to have skills that they can use, not just to provide PPEs, obviously, when that is not needed, but to get into whatever opportunities that will arise out of that. But one important area that most of my teams are involved in is debunking fake news. It is just amazing how much fake news there is out there. Women are not highly literate in most countries, and this type of fake news that is there can be quite dangerous because, fake news about health is not victimless. So that has been also a big part of our work, working together with young people, and I'm so thankful for that.
Fantastic, thank you. And if I can just stay with you for another second longer, are there kind of examples that spring to mind from various different countries or some of your colleagues you may have worked with that would help us illustrate and put a bit more appeal to you?
For instance, in Colombia, we really worked very well with the government in informing the kind of social packages that they've been providing to women, and making sure that, for instance, if there is cash to be given, it goes directly to women, which is very important. Because in a number of countries in Latin America that are quite used to delivering social protection, there was fertile ground. But of course, those were different governments that started the whole social protection giving in Latin America. So we had to really push, therefore, to support them. But civil society there, very, very effective. In Ethiopia, for instance, the issue of languages is a very big country with different indigenous and local languages. Providing the information in the languages that people understand has been very important. In India, we've worked with women to provide PPE, some of them providing this to private sector, and we've been very thankful for those private sector who are buying from women in bulk and buying for schools as well in their community. In South Africa, we've been working with government to track and trace the informal sector and women's businesses in order to put them in front of the queue, as well as tracking people who are HIV positive, which is another challenge because their immune system is very low. And we have been making sure that these people are in front of the queue so that they can be tested sooner, and they can be provided with food as well, because both those, the lack of testing and them having the disease progress and the lack of food is very fatal. to people who are living with HIV and AIDS.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Incredibly important work. And David, if I may turn to you, we've all been very impressed with the innovation and the adaptation with which the IRC has sort of adapted your programs really in response to the current challenges. Tell us more about what you and your team are doing to protect the most vulnerable communities that you work with. And also, if you can help us to sort of figure out how that fits into your macro picture of where you want to go directionally for the organization.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks very much. I mean, we want to be a solutions-focused NGO. We're unusual in being focused on people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster. So we work in 35 to 40 war-torn and refugee-hosting countries. So we have a degree of focus that I think is unusual in the NGO community. And we want to use that focus to make sure that we're a real center of expertise. And I'm very proud that we're now the leading impact evaluation center in the humanitarian sector, because we're on a big drive to make sure that all of our programs are outcome-oriented and evidence-based. When it comes to COVID, we've had three central planks to our work, and each of them has an important gender dimension, which is obviously the focus of this discussion. The first is staff safety. We can't protect our clients unless we keep our staff safe. We have 13,000 employees and 17,000 day workers, as I said, auxiliary workers. The majority are women. 40% of our work is in healthcare. And so you can see the immediate dangers. So our teams were ordering PPE kit, which the Undersecretary General, which Dr. Mlambo-Ngcuka mentioned just now, they were ordering PPE kit in February. Our emergency categorization system was beginning to kick into gear in February. So staff safety has an important gender dimension. And we need to make sure that as staff members, for example, many of our women staff members are the primary carers in their own household for their own children, also for their own parents. I mean, 95% of our staff are locally recruited. So these aren't Western aid workers being jetted into conflict zones. These are local people. And we've had to try and make sure that our staff are not just protected physically, but are able to do their work, including mental health support, actually. The second aspect is obviously frontline health response. And here, I would highlight a couple of things. First of all, prevention is still a vital part of the agenda for the people that we serve. The disease has not yet become a tsunami in the refugee camps in Bangladesh, in northwest Syria, but it is threatening to become such in very important places. The largest country in Africa, Nigeria, is a big concern. Pakistan and Afghanistan, major concerns. Yemen, the world's largest humanitarian crisis, major concern. So the health response is partly preventative, it's partly primary care. It's also absolute, and by the way, the preventative agenda is basic. It's soap, it's hand washing stations, it is fever testing, it's isolation places for those who do have fever. Fever obviously catches people with malaria as well as with COVID, but it's better to have too many isolated than too few. And then also prevention includes the vital issue that Dr. Mlambo-Ngcuka raised, which is we're facing a tidal wave of misinformation. And so our local, credible, trusted staff work with community leaders around the world to make sure that trusted information is going forward. And then the third part of our response speaks to the program innovation that you rightly referred to. Every one of our programs is affected by COVID. If you're running a child protection program, it's affected by COVID. If you're running an education program, it's affected by COVID. If you're running business livelihoods programs, they're affected by COVID because you can't bring people together in the way that you could before. And that's driving new ways of thinking. For example, we're having to use much more remote technology for our education services. We're using everything from radio to WhatsApp for our education services. Our child protection services are having to do things at distance. So are our economic livelihoods services, practicing social distancing while we give training, for example. So in those ways, we're trying to adapt to a COVID world. And frankly, when I hear people talk about post-COVID, that's going to be a long way off for the people that we're helping. This is a new abnormal. It's going to last, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years because the people that we're helping are not going to be front of the queue when it comes to vaccines. And so this is an absolutely fundamental challenge to the humanitarian sector, which has not been really revolutionized by the digital revolution in the last 10 years in the way that business has been. But now it's going to have to be if it's to deliver in this COVID world.
Thank you. And I'll just take a break to ask Dr. Mlambo-Ngcuka if you had anything that you wanted to add in response.
Yes, I seem to have disappeared. Am I still there?
We can see a nice hazy picture.
Yes,
we can hear you perfectly, which is important.
Okay. I don't know. I must have touched something. Technology is against women.
We can see your picture now, which is fantastic.
Okay. So can you ask me the question again?
I know I was just asking if you had anything to add, just taking a little bit of a pause.
Well, I mean, agreeing with what David is saying, it's important to remember that this is a health crisis. One thing I never want to leave these webinars about COVID without saying is that we should be forging ahead with testing and tracing as much as we can. This is complicated also because it costs and it's not easily available, but we must make sure that we do not forget that is important as we do everything else, and helping to buy time for health systems to cope better with the crisis. And also the new normal is really something that we have to reimagine, because the old normal was not good. We do not want to get back to the status quo. Gender-based violence is the old normal. We're fighting it during COVID. We have to continue fighting so that we do not relax and go back to the old normal. That we was saying these essential services must be provided for the long haul, not only during COVID. Or if you are talking about ensuring that girls' education is also accessible online, we must fix the digital infrastructure for the long term, because there's always going to be one crisis or the other that will need the poorest of the poor to have the need for them to have access to digital education. In any case, that is where we were trying to go when we were thinking of the future of work, and we thought that we had some time, and the future arrived overnight. So I'm just saying that the new normal is not anything like what we are doing now, scratching over the surface. It's about getting deeper and removing these underlying circumstances that make the problem to be as big as it is.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think we've got now, well, actually, let me just pause to say that I want to make sure that our listeners on the line also have a chance to ask their questions and to engage in the discussion. So I will sort of open the floor out in about 5 minutes or so. I've got a little portal here, so anyone who has questions, please, you're more than welcome to submit them online, and I'll make sure that they are answered. But before we turn over to that, I mean, the important question here now is really that, you know, we've sort of throughout the conversation covered now why we feel women really are disproportionately impacted by the effects of COVID-19, and also a little bit of detail you've both provided kindly on how your organizations are contributing to the challenge. I want to now move really to the what next. You know, so what next? What are the implications of what we've discussed? You know, what do you want the international community and our listeners here to do to support you in all of our mission? And importantly, you know, what can we all do as activists, as philanthropists, as influencers on this call in our own domains? Perhaps we start with David, if you're...
Thanks, Cheryl. Look, I think there are 3 things that are really important to have in mind here. The first is the need for a global response that is universal and far more effective. I hope I don't tread on any diplomatic toes by saying that the overall international response to the crisis from governments around the world has been utterly hopeless. I mean, they deserve an absolute D- for their way in which governments have neglected the international dimension to this. Of course, governments have a first responsibility to their own citizens. But in a disease like COVID, which is a disease of the connected world, it is utterly myopic for governments to believe that if they solve the problem within their own boundaries, they will get back to normal. They won't. And we are suffering, we globally are suffering from a crisis of leadership at the international level. The people who suffer the most from that crisis of leadership are the most vulnerable in the world. And the most vulnerable in the world are, as we've discussed, include large numbers of women and girls around the world, because there's a gender dimension to global vulnerability. And so the first thing to say that whether it be in respect of peacemaking, which is Antonio Guterres rightly called for a global ceasefire for COVID, that's not been followed. Whether it be in respect of aid funding, where the UN appeals have not been properly met by governments around the world, whether it be in respect of a whole range of aspects, whether it be in respect also of cooperation on the health field, around PPE. The first thing the governments had to do is step up, because at the moment they're stepping back from the international dimensions of this crisis. The second thing that I think is incredibly important is that we recognize that the extra needs of women and girls will not be met just by better universal programs. They need targeted programs. And here the record is really poor as well. I'm sorry to be a merchant of bad news, but work against gender-based violence, just to take that as an example, remains less than 0.21% of the total humanitarian budget. It's a total scandal.
Yeah, right? That's pretty shocking.
Yeah, so despite the excellent efforts of UN Women and others, when it comes to money for specific programs around gender-based violence, there's talk, but there's no proper action. And specific programs really come down to some simple things. If you don't measure it, you don't manage it. So all programs need to be properly gender disaggregated. If you're not targeting the structures of inequality that put women at a disadvantage in the first place, you're not going to be addressing the root causes if you don't involve men, which I know is something that isn't always popular, but UN Women has talked about this a lot. You've got to involve men in this story because it's their daughters, as well as the daughters of women. It's their wives, it's their partners. So there are specific programs that need to be targeted to help the protection of women, the security of women, the opportunities of women, the livelihoods of women. And we can talk more about that. In our own experience, I think it's really interesting that our social programs to protect women from violence are much more effective when they're combined with economic empowerment of women. That's why we talk not just about fighting gender-based violence, we talk about women's protection and empowerment. It's important that the economic and the social go together in addressing gender inequalities. Now, the third aspect of this is, in a world where governments are in retreat from big, complex global problems, what's the role of the private sector and of foundations and of philanthropists in stepping up? Here's my appeal to the people on this call. My view is that big social change, and we're talking about big social change when it comes to the situation of women and girls in conflict and humanitarian distress around the world. Big social change only happens when three things are in place. One, government leadership. Two, business and NGO innovation. Three, mass mobilization. And the question we have today is, what do you do when governments are not offering leadership? And the answer is, businesses, foundations, philanthropists, and NGOs, we have to take up the leadership. And we have to take up the leadership together. Just so you know, I don't want this to be special pleading, but I know that my organization is not unusual. We've raised more money in this crisis from the private sector than we have from the governments. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. I mean, our organization, we're an $800 million organization. 3/4 of our funding usually comes from governments. In this crisis, 95% of the money has come from private sector and foundations. And by the way, it's small beer, $35 million. We need big leadership from the corporate sector, from the foundation sector, and from the philanthropic sector if we're to break through. And that leadership can be about innovation and impact. I really think it's important to say to philanthropists on the phone, our risk capital doesn't come from governments, even though we're 3/4 government funded. Our risk capital comes from philanthropists because they understand that innovation involves risk and you only make gains if you're willing to take risk. And for obvious reasons, governments are much more leery of taking risk. I also think that our focus on outcomes and impact is something that speaks to a business mindset, and many philanthropists have that mindset. So part one, we need a global stepping up that helps all genders. Number two, we need targeted programs at women. Number three, it's going to have to be NGOs and the corporate and foundation and philanthropic sector to do it, because unless we do, we're going to suffer for this for a long time to come.
I think that's wonderful, and it's something that really does speak to the heart of what we advise philanthropists to do, which is to take on risk, because that is the beauty of philanthropic capital. It is so flexible and so different to any other forms of capital. Let's use it to its highest purpose. So thank you very much. And now I will just turn to Dr. Mlambo-Ngcuka. Do you have some perspectives you can share as well on sort of what we can all be doing, the international community at large, the listeners on this call? What would you like to see happen as a what next?
Okay. I don't know, I've disappeared, but at least you can hear me. That's the important thing. Yes,
absolutely. We can see a picture and we can hear you, so please don't feel there.
Firstly, let me just say, because as David said, this is going to be with us for some time, the issue of people's vaccine is actually quite important. Anything and everything we can do to make sure that as the rush for the vaccine is taking place, we are making sure that we're pushing for it to be made available to as many people as there can be in the world. And we know that people in poor countries are not going to be in front of the queue, not unless there is a lot of advocacy that has to come from everybody, private sector, civil society, governments, etc. Secondly, we do need global leadership to reset the world order. I just think that there is so much individualism of nations at this point in time. And the fact that one of the responses to this pandemic has been locking down has created this inward-looking approach to countries. We have to try and dismantle that mentality. Very thankful to the medical fraternity for continuing to collaborate, but we have to push and defend this collaboration and solidarity that touches people everywhere. We need to know, as we have learned from this virus, that a virus anywhere is a virus everywhere. So there's no place to hide for everybody. We need to try and reach people everywhere in the world. So leadership that is of global nature and scale. The size of this problem also is such that we cannot tinker on the cranks. We actually need a new way of thinking that is macro and international, that we must all feel in different countries, and is ambitious to shift the agenda. Anything that is done in small scale is going to mean that we're slipping right back to where we are or worse. Leadership of women is critical. In some of the crises and pandemics that we've seen before, where women were kept on the margin, we actually made the crisis to be worse for the women. In this crisis, as we have seen, women are frontline workers. They are the majority of those women are the ones who are saving us. They are holding more than half of the world in their feet to keep us alive. And yet they are not in decision making. There is no shortage of pipeline here of women to lead. There is an attitude, there's the normalization of exclusion of women, and we need to address that, not just in the best interest of women, but in the best interest of everybody. And also, if I may say, private sector, government, philanthropists, everybody has got to be in this for the right reasons, not just for themselves first. But if you're there for other people, you will be saved too, because you are also a people. So we need to move out of this tunnel vision where it's each one for themselves and we will see about the other.
Thank you so much.
And we need
please.
leaders who speak like that. We absolutely need leaders who speak like that and use their money to drive and deliver that message.
I think that's a beautiful, beautiful segue to a brilliant question we've received from the audience here. You know, speaking to the point about leadership and also about polarization. So the question really is, how do you see the increasingly polarized relationships amongst Europe, the US, China, many other countries around the world? How is that polarization going to impact the global and regional economy, as well as actually really humanitarian efforts around the world? And will this kind of new abnormal international sort of landscape affect women and girls more than men? How is this going to play out? What should we be thinking about? How should we be preparing?
Who are you asking?
Either one of you. I know you'll both have amazing
After
views.
you, but let the Undersecretary, let Dr. Mlambo-Ngcuka go first.
You know, we are polarized on so many fronts, and we have to address all of these together. It does go back to leadership, that there is such a deficit of leadership in the world today at important places, that we tend to find it easy to learn more about what divides us than what unites us. And I think as ordinary citizens, grassroots organization, we really have to be present in the fight and to be very loud. I don't think that it's a mistake that you're seeing people fighting racism on their feet in the streets, because there isn't an easy option to fight in the boardroom. You have to be in it with your whole body to take on the fight, to move the needle. But also we must fight with a purpose when we do that, so that our demands and our definition of what success look like is very clear, so that we can tick when we hit something that is tangible and takes us forward. We need to get the kind of success that will hold for the long term and is not easily reversible. And I'm afraid that this will be something that will be painful for everybody, but there is no other way. We have to stay in it.
Thank you. And David?
Well, the question was about this new or growing polarization in global politics, which I think is a really important part of the macroeconomic or macro political agenda here. The United Nations is only as strong as the unity of its own members. And when its members are fragmented, which we're seeing in the UN Security Council and elsewhere, then there's obviously a real dearth of global leadership. I think that the worst outcome, and the questioner asked us to speculate on this, the worst outcome is obviously that global tension spills over into serious conflict. I mean, many people, including myself, are worried about tension over Taiwan, for example, over the next 6 months in the run-up to the US election. We're seeing the US take risks, and frankly, we're seeing Chinese take risks. And both sides are taking risks that have many of us worried. So that's obviously there. I think it's also important to say, when there is global standoff, global polarization, the question said, it creates a vacuum. So the places that we work, inside Syria, in Yemen, there's a vacuum when it comes to diplomacy. That vacuum of diplomacy gives a space for very bad actors to wreak havoc on their domestic populations. And a vacuum only benefits the powerful. It never benefits the powerless. Finally, I think it's really important to recognize that this COVID crisis is a canary in the mine for what it means to live in a connected world. It's a disease of the connected world, but it's not the only challenge of a connected world. People have looked, in a way, the climate crisis is also a pandemic, in a way. Global inequality, in a way, has pandemic qualities. And so I think it was because of its pervasive nature. I mean, inequality is growing in countries, whether they are capitalist or communist, notionally communist, whether they're market economies or planned economies. And so my take is that this polarization needs to be met with a clear demand for cooperation. And if governments won't do it, then citizens, NGOs, and the corporate sector needs to do it. I would put it like this, and this is important for a corporate audience. You're after all JP Morgan, one of the largest financial institutions in the world. JP Morgan and every other business in the world will not enjoy the blessings of globalization unless it's willing to bear the burdens of globalization. And the burdens of globalization means tackling the inequalities, unsustainabilities, insecurities that are attendant on a more connected world. And Dr. Mlambo-Ngcuka said something really important, and in passing, admittedly, but I think it was a really important point. She was effectively saying, we're only as strong as the weakest link in the chain. That's true when it comes to COVID, but it's also true when it comes to airport security. We're only as strong as the weakest link in the chain. It's true when it comes to the banking systems. We're only as strong as the weakest link in the chain. And the point about this more connected world, which is maybe a better word than globalization, is that it needs to be managed. And there's going to be a hell of an argument coming out of this crisis about whether it was caused by too much globalization, too much connection, or by mismanaged connection. And my view is that the populists and nativists and nationalists will all say, look, this is a disease that was caused by too much connection with the rest of the world, let's retreat. And I think that would be very dangerous indeed, including for women and girls, which the questioner asked about. The answer should not be to say, no, everything's fine, which sometimes is a response, a defensive response. The answer has to be to say, no, we recognize that globalization has to be managed in a different way. And that applies at a political level, it applies at an economic level, because where's the G20 at the moment? But it also applies at the health level. And President Trump is pulling out of the World Health Organization. That seems to be an utterly retrograde step. We need a stronger, more independent, more powerful World Health Organization for a more connected world. And my thought would be, let's use health as the area to show where a different kind of global cooperation can be forged. I think that needs to be not just, the UN has got to be at the heart of it, but it's not just a UN thing. It's true for the private sector, for the NGOs, and for the foundations as well.
Great, and completely agree. This really is just so much bigger than one party. It is just overwhelming sometimes. But if we can hone in a little bit on one of those key parties that you talked about, and it's a question here we've received is what would be the most helpful thing for businesses to be doing and engaging in this?
Well, let me say, maybe let's take JP Morgan, who has such a special place in society, in the economies of the world. When we're talking about the new normal applies to organizations and institutions such as JP Morgan, just as much as it applies to government. They have to be in the forefront of addressing the issues that are hurting humanity. You cannot put a price on that, but the benefits of getting that right is good for all of us. I think none of us can be staying on our lane at this time. We all have to go to where the crisis is and try and address the crisis, because it will get all of us. So the important thing for business is really to come into the space of addressing the issues that are threatening people who are poor, and be part of supporting governments and leading governments in many ways, because governments are likely to listen to private sector. Also, I think private sector must not sell itself short. They have a powerful voice. They should engage with government, but also they should also make their own contribution so that actually government can actually see that private sector is a partner. They are in this together with government, and make use of the considerable skills, resources, influence to push us in the right direction. The kinds of issues that affect women and girls must not be left to women alone, must not be left to civil society alone. Private sector is needed. And because private sector is very masculine, we actually need to see male champions in the leadership of this. That is why we have our campaign called He for She. It is about creating a platform for men to provide progressive and constructive masculinity to quell the toxicity of negative masculinity.
Thank you. So, and I think that was a beautiful answer to another question that we had. Really, you know, I think that has been just now articulated, but the comment here I think is interesting. You know, often it seems that men are willing to be open to conversation until their positions of authority are challenged. And I think that's an important kind of consideration when we think about he for she. But thank you for that. Now we've got a couple of questions which I think will be helpful to bring it back down to sort of the micro level of what is happening on the ground. And this is really, you know, kind of, I think, primarily focused on refugees, these couple of questions. We've got a lot of listeners on the line who are very sort of focused on refugees and have been for a long time with respect to their philanthropy. So first, if I may, you know, sort of how, can you give us a bit of a sense of the situation in refugee camps across the world for women now? What work is being done in them at the moment? And if we could also, David, if you could just answer another question in the middle of that, which is how does IRC work with partners on the ground? And do you provide funding with some of the ground partners as well?
Great.
So really two questions there, but very related.
Yeah, and there's also your previous question about the role of the corporate sector. We'll see if I can wind that in somehow. Look, first of all, if any of your philanthropists are interested in refugees, we're interested in talking to them. So I hope they'll email me, david.milliband@rescue.org. I hope they'll visit our website, www.rescue.org, because they'll hear and see the voices of our clients and our staff members, and we'd be very interested in talking to them. In respect of the refugee populations around the world, there are 30 million refugees and asylum seekers around the world at the moment. About 5 or 5.5 million of them are in refugee camps. And for them, basic health, very basic education, basic food is delivered, but opportunities are severely restricted. That's why I sometimes talk about refugee camps being funeral homes for dreams, because people go there for temporary shelter and then 25 years later they're still there, and that's a real danger. Our work is all about trying to make sure that we do meet basic needs to help people survive, but that we also help them thrive. And that's why the emphasis on education and economic empowerment alongside basic water and sanitation is so important. The truth at the moment is that many of the countries in which there are refugee camps, most of the refugee camps are centered in Africa, but actually now with the Bangladesh is the largest refugee camp for people fleeing from Myanmar. We've got a set of interventions there, often with local partners. But the real local partnership, which was part of the question, comes in for the refugees who are not in refugee camps, who are in amongst host communities. 60% of refugees live in urban areas. Often their housing is not great, but they're participating in the informal economy, in the underground economy. They're not paying taxes. And so the risks that they face and that their children face, risks to their security, but also risks to their livelihoods and risks to their lack of education in the case of kids, demand real engagement with local civil society. And that's something that's absolutely core to the way we work. As I said earlier, we hire locally, but we also seek to work in partnership with local organizations. We're raising money ourselves, so it's sometimes difficult to fund other organizations. But when we apply for government grants, we often do that in partnership with local civil society organizations. And that can be in large projects. We won a major foundation commitment from IKEA in East Africa to help young people in respect of education and employment. It was done with civil society. In the Middle East, where we're delivering the $100 million MacArthur program called 100 and Change, we're working with a civil society in Jordan in delivering education. And So that partnership is a very important part of our work. We always know that if you can engage effectively with parts of civil society as well as with government, you're more sustainable. And so that's the approach that we try to take. And that's one that I think we'd be happy to discuss with any of your listeners.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I know that we're now running up against the clock, but I think, possibly a nice way for me to sort of hand over back to Kam-Shing for closing remarks is really just to say, there's a question here saying, both of your organizations are extremely powerful platforms to create change for communities and women. So how can we as clients participate in the initiatives and programs that both the UN and IRC are pursuing from our home cities around the world, and how can we contribute to the causes? And really, in answer to that, what I will say is that we are going to send around a thank you note to all of you who have participated. Thank you so much for your time from my perspective, with contact details for both the IRC and UN Women, so that you can pursue those discussions should you wish to do so. So with that, I will just hang I'll just hang my hat up and pass it over to Kam-Shing to deliver some closing remarks. But thank you so much, both of you, for a really exhilarating and very informative discussion. Kam-Shing.
Thank you, Cheryl. We have heard today from the two distinguished activists whose work and leadership will sure help to ensure that women's rights are maintained and strengthened. We know that gender equal societies are more prosperous and more sustainable than those with deep disparities. The world's decision makers, private, social, and public, all have an equal opportunity to make gender equality a top priority. But sadly, as the speakers have alluded to, in a world where global leadership is in great deficit, it is even more critical for the private sectors and the private philanthropists to step forward and play an even greater role. So thank you again, Dr. Mlambo-Ngcuka, and also David, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Have a great day ahead.
Thank you.